Welcome everyone again. My name is Oscar Ramirez. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Startup Commons. We all are here today because we want to make a startup succeed, and our goal with this webinar series sessions is to introduce you to the people and solutions that will help you actually achieve that. Today's guest is one of the most important global reference for any government that is looking at improving its ecosystem performance with more than 100 clients across 5 continents in over 40 countries. It is the world leading research and policy advisory organization for governments committed to accelerating their startup ecosystems. Its approach combines proprietary surveys with additional reliable data sources and other reports and research. And as a result, we all have the annual Global Startup Ecosystem Report as a reference to get more clarity and understanding about ecosystems, how ecosystems are evolving and progressing, as well as the type of factors we should consider to find, I would say, the key equation to have more successful startups. Today, we at the Startup Commons are pleased to introduce you to a startup Genome, which is today represented by Mark Pencil and Pranav Arya. Mark is the founder and president leading global growth and impact. And prior to founding a startup Genome, he co-led the startup ecosystem development unit at Silicon Valley-based Startup Compass, and also at PwC and KPMG and Bayern Group's internal management consultancy. Mark advised top executives across various sectors. And Pranav is a senior consultant at Startup Genome. He supports assessment and strategy formulation for ecosystems across the world. He works extensively with Startup Genome's members and partners to drive the largest data collection project on startup ecosystems globally. Mark, Pranav, welcome to the Innovation Entrepreneurship Best Practices webinar series. It is a real pleasure to have you here today with us. The stage is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Thanks to the entire Startup Commons team for the very warm welcome, for the invitation. I know we had quite a few touch points in the past. We're really fans of the Startup Commons work and very excited to be here with you today to share a few of our experiences working with government leaders, but also working with many, many startups around the world and growing our knowledge together on how we can do better to support startups and startup ecosystems. I'd like, Pranav, for you to share your screen and then we can get the presentation going. We will talk for about 25, 30 minutes. Feel free, as Oscar, as you said, to share questions in the chat. We'll be very happy to take all of them after this presentation. And maybe as we get started, just for your information, it was exactly that curiosity that led us to start Startup Genome a couple of years ago, where we were trying to understand what does it actually take for a startup to become a scale-up? What does it take for a scale-up to become a unicorn? And why do 90% of the startups actually fail? What can we learn as startup leaders, as investors, but also as policymakers? And how can we use that knowledge in order to really accelerate startup growth and ecosystem growth and turn regions everywhere into growth engines, right? How can we use that opportunity in the 21st century and create more successful tech companies together? Want to talk about a few things today. Firstly, we want to give you a very quick introduction about Startup Genome's global footprint and the number of organizations we've been working with during the last couple of years. I think that's helpful for context, but really don't waste too much time and jump right into how we're actually tackling an ecosystem assessment project when we work with innovation policy leaders, with government leaders, and how we work with them to prioritize some of the biggest gaps that we see in their ecosystem, which then oftentimes translates to strategy work, right? What can we do in terms of policies? What can we do in terms of programs in order for our founders, our entrepreneurs to create more successful companies? And then oftentimes, depending on the situation and depending on the context, we're also actively supporting with the implementation of these programs and these policies. really to make sure that, we're a close partner to government leaders and helping them succeed in creating thriving ecosystems in their home countries. Starting off with the first point, Startup Genome and our global footprint. You mentioned it, Oscar, right? It's oftentimes described as our claim to fame. In 2012, for the first time, we launched the Global Startup Ecosystem Report, giving all of us as a global community a better sense of what is happening in the world, right? And we do not only care about what is happening in Silicon Valley, in Tel Aviv, in London, but we really want to care about and we want to read about all the exciting innovation and all the exciting activities that is happening elsewhere in the world. So Startup Genome, we're looking at about 250 startup communities and ranking the top 140. And then using that visibility that the report has, that popularity, you can see it here. We've seen around 500,000 unique views and 700 media citations. Give that popularity to regions everywhere for them to share what are their USPs, what are their verticals that they're strong in, and what can others learn from these regions. So this is really what the global report is for. It's for us, it's for you, it's for the global startup community. But then really what we want to focus on, in building this community, as I mentioned earlier, we right now have around 600,000 unique readers that come to our website and about 130 subscribers to our newsletter. The key question that we're asking ourselves every day is how do we actually leverage that popularity and that credibility to help organizations and people like you on this call to take better decisions and drive more successful ecosystems. And this is what we want to talk about mainly today. As we can see on the next slide. Yeah, as we can see on the next slide, first of all, you mentioned that as well, Oscar, right now, we've been working with well over 100 entities during the last 3 years. That growth happened quite faster than I would have imagined in the first place, to be fair. We've been working with ecosystems of all phases, of all sizes, in very challenging, emerging environments, but then also with some of the fastest growing ecosystems such as Tel Aviv or New York. And during the last couple of years, we heard a lot about the success stories, what policies worked, what programs worked, but mainly we heard about all the policies and the programs that did not work, right? And bringing that knowledge together, as you can see on the next slide, where we show our global map of the different organizations that we've been working with, bringing that knowledge together and sharing, for example, on behalf of Helsinki Business Hub, where you're based right now, Oscar, right in Finland, sharing that learning that these organizations have made during the last couple of years with other entities around the world typically helps us take better decisions at home and typically helps us focus our budget on those activities that really accelerate our growth in the fastest possible way. And as we know, what is needed for the most part in order to take these decisions, first of all, is clarity and an understanding of where we are as an ecosystem, right? In terms of the performance across all of the different metrics and areas that we will be looking at together with Pranav in a second, but really creating a common language for us as ecosystem leaders to act on together. I wanted to show you our leadership team just for 1 second, because I think it brings home the fact that it needs different kinds of people with different kinds of backgrounds in order to create an organization like Startup Genome. On the left-hand side, you see our CEO, who's a serial entrepreneur based out of San Francisco. But then, he really codified the research methodology and worked with thousands and thousands of startups around the world to ask them the most critical questions and identify the methodology on our behalf. But then with people like Stefan, for example, who previously led Tech Nation in the UK, we also needed to have a perspective on how innovation agencies behave and what they need and what they learn. And with Tech Nation, of course, we have really a role model, I would say, to many other ecosystems and governments around the world. The programs that they initiated, the policies that they advocated and supported really made a big change to the London ecosystem initially, but then more and more has great effects on the UK's tech community. So it's really important to have Stefan. And then with Trish, we have someone who's very focused on the corporate innovation side, which is also very important, of course. but then also with a background in VC investment. Next slide. Just wanted to show you one of the formats that we're hosting every 2 months when we bring people together, just to put a few faces. I think it always helps. Here you see that, you know, we typically work with the CEOs of innovation agencies, but then also with deputy ministers or the general managers of advisory institutes to governments, really for us to get together and to discuss on an ongoing basis, not only what happened in the 90s, but discuss on an ongoing basis, what are some of the challenges that we're looking into right now? How do we deal with SPACs, for example? What does it mean for our startup community? And, you know, on an ongoing basis, as new topics unfold, the COVID-19 pandemic is probably a great another example. We want to be there for our partners and for our clients, and facilitating monthly and bi-monthly conversations is a very critical element of what we're doing at Startup Genome. At a very high level, before we move into the assessment, strategy, and implementation side, I wanted to show you this overview so that you can take it home and really see for yourself what are some of the key themes that Startup Genome is working on. I mentioned the knowledge exchange part just now. I mentioned the attraction, the global startup ecosystem report, but then also specific collaborations with organizations that look into soft landing programs. The assessment core to our work, which Pranav is going to describe in greater depth in a second, and then also how this assessment is going to support strategy development and how that strategy is then partly implemented by us at Startup Genome, but also with many partners whom we worked with during the last couple of years. This is kind of the summary slide if you were to think of the services and the products that we at Startup Genome currently offer to innovation agency leaders and other government leaders. Okay, then I'd say let's look at the approach. Any typical Startup Genome project starts with an assessment. I mentioned that, and really understanding where does an ecosystem sit on our life cycle model, because that life cycle then has done a pretty good job during the last couple of years in showing and identifying norm strategies. If you're an activation ecosystem with about 200 startups and quite scarce entrepreneurial resources, your government priorities, your innovation policy priorities will be very different in comparison to an ecosystem that is in the attraction phase, where it's much more about tapping into global resources and filling your resource constraints, your resource gaps, for example, in tech talent or in growth talent with international markets. So it's a good first indicator for us to understand, together with our clients and our partners, where do we see you? Where do you see yourself as an ecosystem in comparison to the other hubs that we have in our database and that we've been working with? But then also look at some of the success factors, as we call them, where we look into regulatory measures, regulatory issues, but also how startups, how founders take decisions in growing their startups and growing their companies. And then I mentioned that everything we're doing always has a benchmarking element to it. So we're really eager to look at some of the ecosystems that we think are role models, some of the ecosystems that we think are peers, and use that as a means in order for us to prioritize opportunities, prioritize gaps, and then develop specific targeted recommendations on a 1, 3, and typical 5-year timeline together with our clients. I think now I'll hand it over to Pranav, who is going to talk deeper and talk more about each of the specific steps that we covered here.
Thank you so much, Mark and Oscar, for having us on this webinar. I want to get into the specifics of how it is that we support ecosystem leaders across the entire value chain of startup ecosystem development. So it's spread across 4 phases, and it starts with, of course, assessing, looking under the hood of what exists in the startup ecosystem, all the way to strategizing, creating a plan, and then executing that plan to make sure that maximum returns are generated from the startup ecosystem that we're focusing on. And we help government leaders across all 4 steps of this value chain. I want to start a little bit with assessment and what that entails. But the idea really is to look under the hood, as I mentioned earlier, of what a startup ecosystem consists of. That involves quantifying, not just looking at based on gut feeling, but quantifying key strengths to strengthen global positioning. And on the flip side, identifying gaps that are holding the ecosystem back. So this is what most of the assessment entails. We know that often there are more gaps than our finite resources are able to plug in. But the idea is to look at which gaps are the most important and create the most returns by addressing first. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that. But step one there is to identify the gaps that exist. The third is also very important, which looks at assessing the strengths of local subsectors that exist across the world. We know over the last decade or so that smart specialization, as we call it, is extremely important to accelerating overall development. So when there's strength in a particular startup subsector and it's capitalized on, it results in development of the entire ecosystem by and large. So how do we select the right subsector to capitalize on and help strengthen global positioning? And I want to talk maybe about 5 to 6 exhibits that highlight these 3 things. So I'll get into that very quickly. The first one is more of an introduction to our overall framework for how we are assessing a startup ecosystem. How is it that we're looking under the hood? And the way we do that is by assessing the voice of the entrepreneur, which is by way of our survey. And this allows us to allow entrepreneurs to create data on the experience of the ecosystem. So what it entails, if I'm to break it down very quickly for you, is the local system and the global system. So within the local system, you see there are resources and networks. Resources are talent. I think Mark alluded to some of these: talent, growth talent, technical talent. Funding includes angel investors. Founders refer to how much ambition they have, how much knowledge they have, and the organizations that support ecosystem development, accelerators and incubators. And these are the local resources that are very important at the initial stages of the ecosystem lifecycle, all tied together by local connectedness, the quality and quantity of the relationships that exist between these local resources. That's the local system, and it's incredibly important for initial ecosystem development. And then we move as the ecosystem expands, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. As the ecosystem expands, we start to look more towards the global system, which refers to resource attraction, getting talent and founders and funding from across the borders of the ecosystem, and building global connectedness, which is connections between different founders with leaders across the world of leading ecosystems like Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, London, also measured in terms of how much an ecosystem is able to sell to foreign markets. So this success factor model allows us to quantify every single bucket that you see here and identify any strengths and gaps with respect to over 100 benchmarks. How we contextualize all of this is the ecosystem life cycle. Mark talked a little bit about this. I'll maybe take just a minute to explain this. Over the course of an ecosystem development, ecosystems do not evolve linearly. They evolve over phases, namely, as we call them, activation, globalization, attraction, and integration. Activation phase ecosystems are characterized by having less than 1,000 startups, lots of resource gaps, the resources that we talked about, gaps in funding, gaps in talent, gaps in the knowledge of accelerators and incubators. And it goes all the way up to integration, which is the last phase you see here, which consists of the likes of Silicon Valley, London, New York, which have different strategies essentially as far as helping these ecosystems succeed is concerned. So we call these norm strategies. And at the activation phase, it's important to plug in these resource gaps that we see. And it's important to understand what resource have the most gaps. And we can compare them across benchmarks that live in the same phase. So ecosystem X that lives in the activation phase. If we are trying to assess the talent quality, we can compare it to many other benchmarks that live within the activation phase. But by and large, these are the key objectives of the activation phase: to grow connected community, to increase early stage funding, and to create that initial set of successes in the ecosystem to attract global visibility. When we get to the globalization phase, which is the second phase, the global system, which I talked about earlier, becomes far more important. It becomes about creating globally leading business models, getting that global know-how to do so, increasing global connectedness, selling to foreign markets, and then getting even larger successes to introduce international resource allocation, getting the best talent from across the world, getting the best founders from across the world. But the idea here really is that norm strategies differ with different phases. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to ecosystem development. It's very important to identify which phase of the life cycle it sits in, compare it to relevant peers, and then decide what the key gaps to prioritize are going to be. We also look at the overall scale of performance of an ecosystem. So here you see a pyramid structure for a sample ecosystem, and we try to break it down in terms of how many ecosystems live in different tiers of that pyramid. So for this sample ecosystem, we can kind of get an idea that because there's a seed gap that exists compared to the phase average, it trickles down across different phases, different tiers of that pyramid. When there's a seed gap, there's also a Series A gap. It causes a $100 million scale-up gap and a complete gap in $1 billion. So we're able to basically dissect the different segments that live in the ecosystem, and then further dissect where these gaps are coming from through the success factor models. So in this particular ecosystem's case, we found that global market reach, which is sales to foreign markets, which is critical for creating scale-ups in most ecosystems, was a little bit lower than the phase average. And we see something similar in global connectedness, connections to leaders in Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, London, really the global fabric of knowledge that lives with global startup ecosystems seem to be missing. And we're able to break this down even further and understand where the gaps lie. So within global market reach or foreign sales, we see that while founders are targeting global markets, we see that they're unable to build or currently not building global leading products that foreign markets are going to adopt. So by being able to dissect every individual component of the success factor model, we're able to advise on policies that are most targeted and will create the most value. I mentioned earlier about subsector strengths. Something that we've been exploring over the years has been to quantify the strengths that live in different subsectors of the startup ecosystem. Here you see there's a sample startup ecosystem, and we have tried to rank across 135 ecosystems where the strengths in their particular subsectors live. So we call this the local subsector strength because there are local factors that drive the performance of a subsector. For example, in clean tech, we see that it's top 20 in the world, and it might make sense to specialize specifically in clean tech because there's such a global advantage that we see here based on local context. Things like focus on the startup ecosystem, things like the funding that's available, and things that you don't quite see on the screen here, things like university strength, things like patent development seem to be strong in clean tech. And we're able to assess this across the world to see where those strengths lie. We also look at global potential because local potential is not enough for exporting globally. And global potential allows us to see which subsectors have most exportability. We see that the trend seems to be more in favor of deep tech over the last few years. As you can see, both subsectors that we've highlighted predominantly seem to live in deep tech, and it's an indicator for how much potential specific subsectors have for being exported. And then we overlay those two to try to understand what subsector you should specialize in, depending on what the ecosystem potential is, how strong the local fabric in your ecosystem is for a particular subsector based on universities, patents, existing funding, existing exits, along with the global potential for how much attention that particular subsector is getting, both in terms of funding, exits, sales, et cetera, to be able to identify where on this 2x2 that particular subsector lives, to design really a strategy around this. Another exhibit of how we assess subsectors, particularly in deep tech, is by measuring how traditional innovation overlays with startup ecosystem performance. And this is, like I said, very important in deep tech, but we know that there's a lot of R&D that takes place, say, in life sciences that often does not get commercialized by the startup ecosystem. So how do you measure that? And how do you make sure that your ecosystem, or how do you know how your ecosystem is doing? And we've been able to, with global benchmarks, identify a way to measure that kind of performance. So here on the x-axis, you see traditional innovation ecosystem performance, which really consists of number of patents they've produced in a particular subsector, R&D capabilities, universities, maybe corporations. And on the y-axis, you see startup ecosystem performance. And here in the blue is a regression line that basically tells you what the normal ecosystem average in a sense looks like. So any ecosystem that performs above the regression line typically tends to be punching above its weight in terms of how much traditional innovation ecosystem strength it has compared to how much startup performance is happening. Like Silicon Valley, for example, is producing a lot of startups in this particular sector and doing very, very well, as opposed to Beijing that seems to have a lot of traditional innovation, but not necessarily a lot of startup performance in that same subsector. So frameworks like that allow us to understand what subsectors are doing well, and most importantly, which subsectors have more potential to succeed. As part of, after the assessment, which is really the prelude to understanding what's going on in the ecosystem, Startup Genome builds alignment across the local community. We share our results with key stakeholders, making sure everybody's aligned on the key problems and the key gaps to be prioritized. That's the first way. And the second way is we often help support the development of a leadership group, often called the steering committee, to be able to convene and discuss key issues that exist in the ecosystem. And typically these are people who have the power to make some changes as far as these issues are concerned. That's really the assessment and alignment side of this entire value chain. As far as strategy is concerned, after we know what the gaps are or what the strengths are, and after we're able to bring the community together, we help define the acceleration strategy based on ecosystem lifecycle phase, but also on what strengths exist, what gaps exist, and what the budget scenarios are. So if we were to address a specific gap or capitalize on a particular strength with government intervention, how much does it cost? And almost more importantly, what is the impact that can be driven from employing a particular policy lever to work with strengths and gaps? And this involves, of course, from Startup Genome, understanding budget implications, understanding the returns on economic impact by employing these strategies, and of course, helping the ecosystem committee, the steering committee, become aligned on the particular issues that we want to address.
When we look at the third phase, the planning, what we're typically doing is, first of all, we're aiming to identify together with the community, again, a short-term plan on how to really maximize the return on investment of our government budgets that we have at our disposal as part of this project. And then we typically recommend specific partners and vendors. And it comes back to the point that I mentioned at the very beginning. First of all, the humble realization that Startup Genome can definitely not solve all of the problems that our government clients have, right? But then even in specific areas, Pranav showed the success factor model. There are specific questions and specific requirements around talent attraction. There are others around funding policy and regulation that maybe prohibits VC capital to flow into the ecosystem. Looking at each of these different areas and then identifying partners and vendors whom we've seen do great work during the last couple of years is one of the services that we offer to governments in order to help them take better decisions on who to work with. This is very case dependent, of course, but as you can see on the next slide, we just wanted to bring a few partners to give you a better sense on what are some of the organizations that we consider global leaders in any specific area. For TechNation, for example, I mentioned them, the UK's innovation agency, they really did quite a few policies and programs really well, but I'll mention the scale-up programs that they recently, or that they developed a few years ago already. In many ecosystems, we're seeing that there is a strong foundation, lots of startups, lots of activities, but then when we bring back the pyramid that Pranav showed, it's oftentimes difficult for us as a community to create a few really global category leaders and global winners that then create, a lot of additional opportunities for the startup ecosystem. Thanks. And TechNation deliberately tried to tackle that problem by bringing a few specific high growth programs into the ecosystem where the best of the best were selected and then, went through a 6-month mentorship program, went through a program where they were introduced to corporations as customers, et cetera, et cetera. And that really helped the ecosystem create more wealth and create non-linear progress faster than other ecosystems that we've been working with. But then, I mentioned that the challenges can be very different. Funding policy, we typically work with organizations and people like Josh Lerner, who's done, decades of research on this topic and really understood the intricacies and the difficulties in government-led investment into VC ecosystems. And then one other example, because we've been talking about attraction as well, is that there are organizations that really have specialized on, appealing to and speaking to the global tech community. And we oftentimes have been working with the Next Web and the Financial Times in order to really, showcase some of the exciting things that our government clients and ecosystem leaders have been leading locally, so that they, really also leave the country and other organizations, other regions hear about some of the things that are happening in other places.
Thanks, Mark. The final phase of this value chain, after planning with, of course, our trusted partners on strategy, is the execution itself. Startup Genome provides a lot of implementation support with project management, guidance, and facilitation, as I mentioned earlier, of a steering committee on an ongoing basis, so that issues that continue to arise will be addressed by this steering committee, and also ongoing monitoring through data-driven frameworks to understand and build KPIs that can help us track the performance of the ecosystem, not just as a program is being implemented, but even afterwards, to see if the desired impact is being achieved as it needs to be revisited. So that's the full set of things that Startup Genome is able to do for the assessment and execute all the way to the execution stage. I want to quickly, as I have just a couple of minutes, talk a little bit about some case studies that we've worked on in the recent past. I presented the success factor model earlier, but I believe that that's a 10,000-foot view into an overall ecosystem assessment. We've also had the pleasure on the back of our ecosystem assessments to go a little bit deeper into individual actors of the startup ecosystems and help them with very specific problems in a bit to accelerate the overall startup ecosystem. Maybe there are 4 here on the slide. I'll talk about just 2 or 3. In the Middle East, for example, in the Gulf, we were able to support a regulatory body with their specific startup enactment policies, registration policies, and general legal frameworks that were hindrances or bottlenecks to the development of startups. When we did our ecosystem assessment, we found that entrepreneurship velocity or entrepreneurship momentum was low. Creation of startups was not happening at this rate that typically takes place in that phase of the life cycle. So we were able to zoom in and analyze what the regulatory bottlenecks were. Spoiler alert, it was, I guess, predominantly in the form of bankruptcy, also in the form of cost of setting up. And we were able to convene a leadership committee to be able to discuss these issues and recommend policies to overcome some of the barriers that we were able to see with best practice examples. Another example is in the world of venture capital. So recently we've had the pleasure of working with a leader in Southeast Asia. They have one of the most successful startup ecosystems globally, but what they're missing right now is internationalization of their venture capital environment. So there is a lot of domestic activity, but because of a lack of internationalization, they tend to miss out on FDI, of course, but also the experience that comes with Silicon Valley or New York or a London-based VC, since they've been doing this for over 20 or 40 years in some cases. So we were able to help them quantify what that gap looks like and bring to them best practices that are important for them to look at attracting more international venture capital and also strategies that different ecosystems have employed, both from the private sector side as well as the public sector side. We've also worked a little bit with accelerators and incubators, not specifically with the accelerators and incubators, but from a policy landscape, we've helped ecosystems assess which accelerators and incubators are the strongest in the ecosystem. So in one case, we had a World Bank funded project for an ecosystem that was trying to support one or two support organizations, accelerators and incubators, to help accelerate the success of startups, but did not necessarily have a criteria for evaluation in terms of which of these support organization gets the investment that they need. That's where Startup Genome came in. We were able to create a dedicated framework based on their objectives and their ecosystem strategy for evaluating what the best organizations will be and where they need the most support by disaggregating what they're able to bring to the startup ecosystem. We also did a similar exercise in Western Europe, although a little bit more top level, after our recommendations on starting a subsector program based on certain subsector strengths. This provincial government in Western Europe wanted help in terms of designing an RFP process for what needs to be the criteria for different accelerators and incubators that are applying, as well as guidance along the way for this procedure to be able to co-evaluate certain proposals and understand which proposals would make the most sense based on the strengths and gaps that we analyzed in the first phase of this. That's a little bit of a quick overview of how deep we've been able to go in some of these cases. We're of course doing more, and I'd love to keep all of you in the loop. But for now, that's pretty much all we have. If there are any questions, and please feel free to maybe shoot them on the chat or raise your hand.
Thanks, thanks Pranav, thanks Mark for this great presentation and basically to help everyone to get more understanding about how an ecosystem assessment should be addressed. And one of the things that really is great to see is how Startup Genome is doing this amazing work to decode the startup success. And one of the things that also we usually get when working with ecosystem is like if you are starting to see any kind of correlation between different components or different factors that are part of the whole ecosystem. You know that it's quite usual that when you are working with ecosystems that you want to adjust one thing because something's not working, but then while you are adjusting one thing, then the other thing is basically becoming a mess, right? So are you through your reports, are you basically identifying those correlations at ecosystem level?
So what we're doing beyond the global report goes a lot deeper, right? As you've seen the work that Pranav shared. And yeah, we're definitely looking at the correlations, and we're looking at the system as a whole, right? As you rightly said, you cannot fix one thing in a silo and expect for it to take off. And a very good example typically is, you know, in an activation or emerging ecosystem environment, that you need a few different things, right? You need more entrepreneurial resources, which means you need more people to want to try it out and to want to get started, build companies, right? Fail, have experience under their belt, try it again, etc., etc. But at the same time, you also need early stage capital in order to fund some of these projects and to make sure that some of these, you know, these founders and these projects can actually grow and develop. And yeah, it's been very interesting to see. Again, this is important why we not look at just a few ecosystems, but really the 250 ecosystems in our scope to understand, you know, where are some of the intricacies and where are some of the correlations where behavior X leads to, or where input A leads to output B. This is very critical work. And, you know, it's maybe a bit similar to neuroscience, right? We're halfway there, or we're perhaps 80–90% there, if I can make a bold statement here, but there are a few elements still in ecosystem development that are very hard to measure, very hard to understand, and then very, very context dependent as well. So, you know, we built a mathematical model. It makes perfect sense. Ecosystems tend to go through these 4 phases that we identify, and there are clear norm strategies that make a lot of sense. But, you know, every once in a while you see a few outliers and developments that we as ecosystem leaders and ecosystem builders do not understand and aren't able to capture. And that's good. This is why we're collaborating with you, with Startup Commons, with the people that listen here today, right? I think Startup Genome, I can say that on behalf of the team, is all about collaborating with you and understanding your context, your experiences, and, you know, using all of these insights and anecdotal evidence to do an even better job at decoding startup success and startup ecosystem success down the road.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We are getting some questions in the Q&A feature. I think that Pranav was trying to type those, but I think you want to go live with the response. So the first one is like, how open is the access to the data that you are generating?
So basically, we're looking at, let's pick funding, for example, funding data, right? That's oftentimes very relevant. We're aggregating data from the most important databases in the world, Crunchbase, PitchBook, Dealroom, and then we have our own team that is basically looking at deduplication, that is looking at, you know, what are some of the subsectors, what are some of the exits that we need to correct that are in one system and they shouldn't be in another system, et cetera, et cetera. And these are service providers, right? So there is limited opportunity for us to share what's been developed and what's sold as a service from data providers such as Crunchbase or Dealroom. So we share that type of data on an aggregate level, anonymized with our clients, with the partners, with the ecosystem, so that everyone understands the direction of the community without exactly understanding, you know, what we're doing and how we looked at any specific company. That's also true for the survey, as you can imagine, and as you can imagine, right? Confidentiality is key. We've had well over 50,000 startup founders during the last 7-8 years take 15 minutes of their time to answer our survey, which in our perspective makes it the world's largest primary research with startup founders or startup executives. And you know, they give us very confidential numbers like revenue, percentage of international customers, or the funding round that they raised, etc., which is oftentimes not to be disclosed. And yeah, our credibility is on the line. We would never be able to share these insights that founders give to us with an external audience. Again, with the caveat that we're providing aggregate analysis, anonymized analysis, and those we share with the entire ecosystem in the form of, you know, reports on any given ecosystem, but then also through the global startup ecosystem report, where we bring it together at an even higher, more global, galactic kind of level.
Yeah. So more questions from the audience. Sunil, he said that I work as an ecosystem developer in Gujarat, work with the government, VCs, and 33 incubators and angel investors. So I want to go to the next level. So how to get started with Startup Genome?
Yeah, this is very nice to hear. Hi to Gujarat. And let me mention that we have quite a few states that are already part of the Startup Genome Network. And I myself am part of the CII Startup Council led by Chris Gopalakrishnan. So I'm very closely related with ecosystem development leaders in India. And we have projects in Kerala, in Karnataka, and Telangana at the moment. I've had a few first conversations with people in Gujarat, and we're very interested to have a conversation with you, Sunil, in order to make that happen. I can share more details with you offline, but there are some very easy first steps that we can take in order to give the local community an opportunity to participate in our network.
Great.
And perhaps, Pranav, we can share our email addresses so that we can be reached after this.
I'll do it right now. Thank you.
Definitely. And I think that is one of the key questions also, how to create, what is the key ingredients or factors to create unicorns? That's a funny question, right?
It is a funny question. It's a very important one to many people. And I mean, in the end, what we're seeing is that impressive exits, they tend to act as triggers to the ecosystem, right? I mean, these exits, they create a lot of wealth, they create a lot of visibility. And that is also true for the big billion-dollar unicorns, right? They are really a landmark in the local and the global startup ecosystem. So I do understand why government leaders and ecosystem builders, they're looking at it as an important metric. But of course, it's very hard to pin down what exactly it takes to create those. The team has done an incredible job, I think, to explain part of the equation, I think. And what we found is that, first of all, the successful founders, they tend to be part of the global knowledge network, right? They tend to have good connections to top founders in other ecosystems. They tend to understand what are frontier technologies. They tend to understand growth tactics. They tend to understand how to engage big corporations in order to sell their products and services. And this is through an ongoing exchange at events, at conferences, right? Meeting people. This is not a LinkedIn connection, but being part of a global network of founders. We've seen that in our data. The more connections you have to top founders in other ecosystems, the higher your likelihood to gain global market reach, which is the ability to sell to customers outside of my region, which then drives, the mantra of going global, being able to build unicorns or global winners from day one, right? Global connections oftentimes lead to global market reach, and that global market reach enables for revenue growth that's about twice as fast as those startups that tend to focus on domestic markets, right? And with a small caveat that Indian startups are doing fine if they penetrate the entire Indian market, and Chinese companies are doing fine if they penetrate the Chinese market. But really, on average, the more connections you have to other founders, the more you tend to focus on a global product, a global business model, and a global customer base, the higher the likelihood for you to actually build a fast-growing scale-up or even a unicorn. Which is very unlikely, but I mean, why not beat the odds?
I may add also, the development of scale-ups or unicorns in general, really, I like to see them as lagging indicators. When there is a successful, well-functioning, well-oiled machine as far as the success factor model is concerned, that's typically when most ecosystems start to see those outsized successes. There are a little bit of exceptions as far as India is concerned, as Mark alluded to, because the global system might not necessarily need to be the strongest, but that's an aggregate. When we look at specific parts of the global system, such as global connectedness, that is definitely a piece that we've seen to be critical to the formation of any scale-up, or to the formation of scale-ups in any ecosystem, rather. So this is extremely important to the formation of scale-ups in general, and the stronger the global system, typically, the less gaps you have here at the top, and 100 million scale-ups and $1 billion club, and that's what we've seen in our data.
Yeah, and I would say that also there is at least one thing that is not under our control, which is the market timing, and that is always something that is always there, and it has like a big impact in the scaling up phases mainly, and we don't. I would say we don't have the right tools to predict that, but we with more AI and more big data, that will be easier to predict, right?
There is some interesting research, actually. One of our colleagues based out of the Netherlands, he's been doing some work that he called riding the wave, where he looked at specific unicorns, their verticals that they were focused on, and the number of Google searches and a few other metrics that pointed to the fact if a specific topic, for example, mental health in a specific area, picked up a lot in media or by citizens browsing on the web, etc. And he was able to show, I think there's some other literature that points to that you're, especially you're able to grow into a fast growing scale up or a unicorn if you, for some random reason, it might be pure coincidence, or it might be, your capability to ride a wave and really position your company at a time where, all the VCs are looking at it, the market needs it a lot, etc., etc. That's very interesting question, and very interesting thought to think about.
Yeah. So we also got one more question from Srinivas Savale. So how do you see incubators working together for the facilitating the support for to the innovator?
Maybe I'll take that on a little bit. Thank you, Srinivas, for your question. I think it's not, there's no easy answer to this, but it really depends specifically on the landscape that we're working with. One example maybe I'd like to bring up is a case that we're working on with a country in Northern Europe, Nordic country. And they seem to have a problem of incubators being unable to work with each other from a policy roadblock perspective. And this is something that they're actively trying to overcome because different incubators offer different strengths. And startups often like to be part of multiple incubators to really get the best of all worlds, particularly those high performing startups. So there are some cases where it's more of a policy question. Some government funded incubators, for example, do not facilitate one startup working with multiple incubators from a resource perspective, and that makes some sense to a degree. But the way I see it, it is important depending on the environment, but there's no easy one-size-fits-all answer for how they could work together better. It depends on what constraints they have in terms of working together at the moment. Like in this case, it seems to be policy.
All right. I would like to come back to one of your slides when you represent somehow the collaboration between the traditional innovation ecosystem working with the startup ecosystem. So we usually also try to identify inefficiencies at ecosystem level, and I would say that is one of the most challenging things to resolve at ecosystem level. How to basically to enable that collaboration between these two different worlds. So have you identified through your work, through your research, the kind of factors that are avoiding to work more together between the traditional innovation world and the startup world?
Very important topic, Oscar, that you mentioned. I'm not sure I understood your question exactly, but maybe I can just start sharing a few thoughts and then we can take it from there. You're exactly right. Again, very on point. This is one of the most important topics that we're thinking about. And basically, you know, what we're essentially trying to do is to build what we call ambidextrous clusters, where we bring together academia, corporations, and the innovators, the startups, right, in order for them to basically have an aligned understanding of what are some of the problems worth solving and what are also some of the capabilities on the innovator side in academia, so that we can contribute to the development of solutions. And we're seeing quite a few initiatives, sometimes initiatives that sit directly within the universities, like Creative Destruction Lab. We recently had a session from their management team who are describing to our clients, to our members, how they approach the development of, you know, commercialization activities and how to basically bring more of that basic research, that capabilities into your startup community. But there are also many other ways to bring that into the community, and it starts by, you know, having university students touch entrepreneurship, not necessarily learn about entrepreneurship, right? So maybe a paradigm shift that we still have to do, changing entrepreneurial education from, you know, very theoretically focused education to letting entrepreneurs, like the young entrepreneurs at universities, let them try things out, or let them at least join an entrepreneurial context so they can contribute. There are a lot of different initiatives, and we see that it's an important topic. Of course, we see a very strong innovation ecosystem all around the world, right? There is you know, economies like Korea, for example, is a very good example where you have very strong universities, very strong corporations. And now there is a lot of investment into creating these clusters that create thriving startup ecosystems. Big topic, lots of conversations. If you have anything specific that you wanted to talk about, maybe you could go another time.
Yeah, it's mainly like this is something that is, again, it is repeating all the time in many ecosystems. Mm-hmm. and it's a pity when you look a lot of effort and a lot of resources put in there to create more R&D, and that asset is not being transferred to the market, and it's not impacting on creating like more disruptive organizations or businesses in general.
Yeah.
And of course, from our side, it's clear that, for example, in some places there's no enough motivation from the researchers to initiate a company, but at the same time there are places where also the whole environment is not really friendly for you to basically to share that research to make it work for a company. So that's the kind of things that we are seeing that should be fixed, because it will have like a lot of impact.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, strongly second what you said. And typically what it comes down to, as far as researchers are concerned, is an incentivation, right? What am I being incentivized for? And then how does it shape my behavior as a professional, right? And if I'm not at all incentivized to bring some of my research or some of my PhD's research to the market, but I'm being incentivized on citations, right? Then how does that really come together with trying to build an innovation ecosystem that's really looking at the startups and the innovators as a means to create a bridge to the private sector? So there's a lot of work to be done, and as we know, these are not the most trivial questions that we tackle, because it fundamentally questions a few of the big questions in society and in higher education, etc. So yeah, ongoing process, but we're definitely working to solve some of these gaps.
Right. So we are getting to the end. I think that we don't have more questions. Any final words or thoughts or comments that you want to take now, Mark and Pranav?
So perhaps just from my side, I realize whenever we speak to people and they look at Startup Genome and the work that we've led during the last couple of years, that it's a somewhat difficult topic and hard to understand why we're looking at specific metrics, why we're following specific methodologies, etc. And I want to use this opportunity perhaps to express to everyone that this was an introduction and an invitation for you to engage more with us, with our team, with the work that we've produced. I really recommend reading, downloading some of the publications that we produced during the last couple of years. And yeah, invite you to be part of the journey as we're trying to build better, more equitable ecosystems globally.
Great. Pranav, anything from your side?
I think that sums it up quite well. I'd love to continue the conversation with anyone who's curious. So feel free to reach out to us. Mark's email address is here and mine is here on the right too. We invite any questions, any comments, any potential collaboration. And we just look forward to hearing from you.
Great. By the way, when is the next release of the global report from Startup Genome?
Good point. We should have put that into the slides, actually. We're launching the 2021 report during London Tech Week. And that's going to be September 22nd, I think, together with London and Partners and quite a few other organizations that are involved. Finally being able to present the report in person again after last year's digital launch. So yeah, very much looking forward, and definitely invite all of you to join that launch event together with us.
Good. Stay tuned, guys. So next launching will be on September. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm pretty confident that now after this session, everyone will know the kind of research process that is needed to understand your ecosystem performance, and hopefully Startup Genome will help with that due to extensive experience. So from our side, we will continue working on bringing best practices pieces of this ecosystem development puzzle to help you succeed in your plans to support innovation and entrepreneurship. More webinars are coming, and meanwhile, stay safe, stay healthy. For those who are about to start the summer and moving towards the holidays, so I hope you enjoy and come back with charged batteries. Bye-bye.